Movies made the Middle Ages look like a world where everyone was filthy, died at 30, fought with giant swords, and believed the earth was flat. The problem is, most of that is wrong. Some of the biggest things people think they know about medieval life come straight from Hollywood, not history. And once you see what the Middle Ages were actually like, the real story is far stranger than the movies.
Myth number 1. Everyone died at 30.
One of the biggest myths about the Middle Ages is that people rarely live past 30 years old. Movies often make it seem like anyone who reached 30 was already considered ancient, but that's not actually true. The confusion comes from life expectancy statistics. Medieval societies had extremely high infant mortality rates, meaning many children died before reaching adulthood. That dragged the average age down dramatically. But if someone survived childhood, their chances improved significantly. Plenty of people lived into their 50s, 60s, and sometimes even beyond. Kings, merchants, craftsmen, monks, and even ordinary peasants could reach what we'd consider old age. People weren't dropping dead the moment they turned 30. The numbers only look that way because so many children never had the chance to grow up. Myth number 2. Medieval people never bathed. According to Hollywood, the Middle Ages were filled with people who never touched water and spent their entire lives covered in dirt. The reality is far more complicated. Across medieval Europe, public bathhouses existed in many towns and cities. People washed their hands, faces, and bodies more often than most movies suggest. Soap was widely known, and cleanliness was generally considered desirable. Even monasteries often had washing facilities. It's true that standards of hygiene were different from today, and regular hot baths weren't always available to everyone. But medieval people did not simply avoid bathing. They understood cleanliness and practiced it whenever circumstances allowed. Myth number 3. Knights could barely move in armor. Movies love showing armored knights falling to the ground and becoming helpless turtles stuck on their backs. Real medieval armor didn't work like that. A full suit of plate armor typically weighed between 20 and 30 kilograms, which sounds heavy until you realize the weight was distributed across the entire body. Knights trained for years while wearing armor and were surprisingly agile. They could run, climb ladders, mount horses, wrestle, and fight effectively. Modern experiments have repeatedly shown that trained people can perform athletic movements while wearing accurate medieval armor. A knight trapped inside his armor wasn't a walking statue. He was a professional warrior wearing some of the most advanced protective equipment of his time. Myth number 4. The Middle Ages were grey and colorless. Hollywood often portrays medieval Europe as a world of mud, fog, and endless shades of brown. But if you traveled back in time, you'd likely see far more color than you expect. Wealthy people wore brightly dyed clothing to display status and wealth. Banners, shields, and coats of arms were painted in vivid colors. Churches were often decorated with colorful artwork, and many castles and buildings were painted rather than left as bare stone. Even everyday objects could be surprisingly colorful. The image of a permanently grey Middle Ages comes more from modern filmmaking than from historical reality. Myth number 5. Everyone thought the Earth was flat. One of the most persistent myths about the Middle Ages is that everyone believed the Earth was flat until a brave explorer proved otherwise. In reality, educated people had known the Earth was spherical for centuries. Medieval scholars inherited this knowledge from ancient Greek and Roman writers, and it was taught in universities throughout Europe. Astronomers, theologians, and educated elites generally accepted a round Earth. Christopher Columbus was not trying to prove that the planet was spherical. The real debate was about its size and the distance to Asia. The idea that medieval people universally believed in a flat Earth is mostly a myth created long after the Middle Ages ended. Myth number 6. Swords were the main weapon. Movies make it seem like every medieval battle was won by heroic warriors swinging swords. In reality, swords were often secondary weapons. On actual battlefields, weapons like spears, pikes, poleaxes, bows, and crossbows were usually far more important. Spears were cheaper, easier to use, and incredibly effective in formation combat. A sword was valuable, versatile, and prestigious. But it was not always the king of the battlefield. Many soldiers relied on other weapons for most of the fighting, keeping a sword as a backup if needed. Myth number 7. Castles were just cold stone fortresses. Movie castles often look dark, empty, and uncomfortable. While castles were designed for defense, many were also homes for powerful families. Their interiors could be surprisingly luxurious. Walls were decorated with colorful tapestries, wooden furniture, artwork, and fabrics. Large fireplaces provided heat, and wealthy residents surrounded themselves with symbols of status and comfort. Some castles were less like grim military bunkers and more like prestigious residences that also happened to be heavily fortified. Myth number 8. Peasants were miserable. Every second of their lives as a medieval peasant was undoubtedly difficult. There was hard labor, disease, poor harvests, and limited opportunities. But movies sometimes portray peasants as endlessly miserable people with no joy whatsoever. The reality is more human. Medieval communities celebrated religious festivals, weddings, fairs, and seasonal events. People played games, listened to music, danced, drank, told stories, and socialized. They laughed, fell in love, argued with neighbors, and enjoyed entertainment whenever they could. Their lives were hard, but they weren't living in constant misery every moment of every day. Myth number 9. Battles looked like movie battles. Hollywood battles often turn into thousands of individuals running randomly across a field and fighting dramatic one-on-one duels. Real medieval warfare was usually much more organized. Discipline, formations, terrain, logistics, and leadership often mattered more than individual heroics. Soldiers fought as part of groups, not as isolated action heroes. Many battles were decided by maintaining formation or breaking the enemy's formation, rather than by cinematic sword fights. Real warfare was often less glamorous and far more brutal than what movies show. Myth number 10. Vikings wore horned helmets. Even though Vikings belonged to the early medieval world rather than the later Middle Ages, this myth is too famous to ignore. The image of Vikings wearing horned helmets appears everywhere in movies, TV shows, and advertisements. The problem is that archaeologists have found no evidence that Viking warriors wore horned helmets in battle. The idea became popular during the 19th century when artists and costume designers wanted Vikings to look more dramatic. One of history's most iconic images was created centuries after the Vikings themselves disappeared. Myth number 11. The Church hated science. Many movies portray the Middle Ages as a time when science completely disappeared and the Church fought against all knowledge. The reality is much more complicated. Medieval monasteries preserved countless ancient texts, and some of Europe's first universities were founded during the Middle Ages. Scholars studied astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy long before the Renaissance began. While conflicts certainly existed, the idea that medieval Europe spent 1,000 years rejecting knowledge is largely a myth. Much of the learning that later fueled the Renaissance survived because medieval scholars kept it alive. Myth number 12. Medieval people were constantly drunk because water was unsafe. You've probably heard that medieval people drank beer all day because water was too dangerous to drink. While beer and ale were extremely common, the story isn't quite that simple. Medieval people absolutely drank water when clean sources were available. Wells, springs, rivers, and public water systems supplied many communities. People understood that some water sources were safer than others, and they often chose them carefully. Beer was popular because it provided calories and could be stored, but medieval Europeans were not spending their entire lives avoiding water. Like many things about the Middle Ages, the reality was far less extreme than the myth. What's interesting is that most of these myths survived because they're simple. A dirty world is easier to recognize than a colorful one. A knight trapped inside his armor is easier to defeat than a trained warrior, and a world where everyone was ignorant is easier to laugh at than one that's actually complicated. The real Middle Ages weren't perfect. Life was often harsh, dangerous, and unfair. But they also weren't the dark fantasy version that movies have sold for decades. And that's what makes medieval history so fascinating. The truth is usually stranger than the myth.